Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. Under siege, Naruto could have sworn his floor shook and his walls groaned. He could almost hear the barricade tumbling forward as he hid under his worn bed as a stampede flooded his apartment. It was, without fail, every once in a blue moon the idiots of the village would pillage his apartment, just hoping to punish him, though for what he didn't know. Shadows snuggled him in a comforting embrace, offering false asylum. His arms hugged his knees, trying to aid his shivers each time a crash or roar sounded like the horns of war. It was hell. There was no other word, no verb or noun could possibly explain as well. The door crashed. Naruto pressed himself to the cracked wall behind him to hide himself further, coating himself in the comfort of the dark. It was almost frightening how fast some of the villagers rampaged through, and how fast they seemed to forget where most children hide in blind anger. Not that it mattered. Naruto had left a trail away from the apartment and back out into the streets for such an occasion. After all, when idiots charge through, they don't expect a child to be able to lure them away. They expect the obvious. It had worked in the past and he'd hope it'd work again. Naruto's breath became shallower as footsteps neared him. The deep drum of each lumbering collision pulsated. Then the voice of a woman came from deeper in, perhaps the kitchen. "Have you found him yet?" The feet stopped in front of him and a deep bellowing voice answered, "Not yet." The man turned to the woman. "Have you considered he might be gone?" "There's no way." The woman said, "We've been right outside his door. There's no chance he got out." Naruto looked around for a second before deciding to trigger one of his traps. Hopefully they would take it as him trying to run out. "You remember last year, right?" No response. The woman must have nodded. Little brat ran out the kitchen window. The woman sighed, "All right. Make sure you check under the bed. Never know if the little brat's hiding under there." This time Naruto saw the man's feet turn to him, and like a trigger he knew it was time. Naruto released a rope near him from its knot and a loud crash echoed from his bathroom. The man's feet in front of him clobbered to face his bathroom with a certain rage to it. "Hey, did you hear that?" Another pair of feet came closer and into his sights as he prayed to whoever was up there that they would take the bait. "Please, go. Please, leave," Naruto whispered hopefully. After 5 minutes spent listening to the rumblings and ramblings of the villagers, silence came. Along with his best friend out of a mirror in his bathroom, a sheen of ice just layered over it. "Naruto-kun, they're gone," she whispered. Blue eyes opened to widen at the sight of his best friend's stare, concern marring her brown eyes. But he was anxious, wondering where she went, why she left, because when she did his anxiety became a monster on its own and terrorized his mind, for she had only just entered his life and he didn't want to lose her. Bringing a digit to his lips she tried to assuage his mind. "Naruto-kun, shush. I never left." Sometimes it was scary at how well she could read him. "Where'd you hide, though?" Naruto sniffled as he wiped his nose. "I can use ice too." She paused, hastily searching for a way to explain. "I hid on a mirror in the bathroom using my ice. I'll explain more later." "All right, Naruto-kun. Come," she said softly. Naruto nodded and smiled shortly. The girl reached under and pulled him out before she held him close. Naruto scrunched his eyes shut and wrapped his arms around the girl's waist, burrowing himself in the crook of her neck. He could feel her put her chin on the back of his head in a comforting gesture. "Promise me something," Naruto muffled out. The girl held him tighter. "Yes. Please don't ever leave, Haku-chan." Naruto didn't need to hear her answer, for he knew her response by heart now. He could only guess he needed reassurance from time to time. Haku giggled, "I promise." Nearing dusk, Naruto and Haku laid together in his bed with him closest to the wall, with Haku's arms entangling themselves around him in a soft embrace. Before, when he lived alone, he may have slept alone, but now Haku never left his side. Haku preferred it that way, Naruto guessed. It was her idea to when she first came to witness long ago. She'd said that she'd act as his shield on his darkest nights, and the same for her. He would stay in their little fortress and would stay sheltered by the wall in her. A protective cocoon, she joked. Naruto turned his head to gaze a second or two to meet her own. Staring serenely, she slowly grew to garner the smallest of smiles on her face before resting and closing her own. He looked further at her hellish black hair contrasting her beautiful ivory skin, and before he knew it he found himself looking at her usual nightwear. A pink shirt with matching shorts. Naruto blushed momentarily. What is wrong with me? He thought. Shaking his head, Naruto looked back up and wriggled himself until he was facing her. Taking an extra dose of courage, Naruto wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close until there was no room between them. Naruto's breath hitched at the sound of her voice. Naruto, promise me something. Anything. Naruto said. Never leave me. He held her closer. All right. After a short moment of silence, Haku wrapped one leg around Naruto and looked up. Naruto was about to ask what she was doing, but was silenced after Haku gingerly kissed his cheek, causing his face to redden and her to smile. She giggled a second at him simply from how comical he looked. Tomorrow's the first day at the academy, Naruto. Haku exclaimed softly, breaking Naruto from his embarrassment. Naruto nodded. I know. I wonder how people will react when they see us. Who knows? I just hope that we get put in the same class. I know. After all the trouble Gigi went through to clear your name, I'd hope we were. Haku giggled gently and closed her eyes. Good night, Naruto. Good night, Haku. Shining lights broke through the window in a spark, fighting the darkness away from the two bodies lying in the small room. The cracked walls gave permission to have shadows cast upon them as the sun rose through, waking Haku. The raven-haired girl lifted her head slightly to wince at the painful sight of the sun. She turned her head away slightly and brought herself up to block out the offending thing with her free hand. I wonder. Haku looked down towards Naruto and gently touched his shoulder before attempting to shake him a tad harder. Haku furrowed her brow slightly and looked over towards Naruto's face up close. Smirking, Haku saw him silently snore with a little puddle of drool on his pillow. Haku stood and looked towards the clock as she stretched. 6:45. After she finished stretching, Haku pondered for a moment on whether she should use a trick she picked up when she first started living there or if she should simply shake him awake. Frankly, it was obvious. She'd go with the former, just because she wanted to see how Naruto would respond. Whether he grew out of the habit or not was up for debate, but Haku didn't care. Gently turning on the stove, Haku put on a pot full of water and began making some ramen. If she made it well, then she'd be killing two birds with one stone, meaning in a wake and fed Naruto. That wasn't to say he couldn't wake up on his own. She just enjoyed doing this more. A few minutes later and the ramen was done. Haku picked a bowl, filled it, and went over to a still sleeping Naruto. Haku placed the bowl on the nightstand beside the bed. Now it was a waiting game to see whether Naruto would wake up because of the aroma or if he would sleep through it. Though Haku gave special attention to his nose. Whenever that nose of his started twitching sporadically and that special little sniffing sound would come out, meant something good would happen. Haku smirked. Either way, Naruto would end up awake and fed. In the end, it didn't take long, because once his nose picked up the scent and that magical little sniffing sound came, his eyes opened wide. Hey Haku, Naruto said drowsily. Haku just smiled coyly as he looked around. Do you smell that? Naruto looked at Haku strangely and wondered why she wasn't saying anything until he noticed where she was looking. Turning his head to where she was silently gesturing to, Naruto chuckled, finally getting why. Thanks, Naruto said as he picked up the bowl. Looking over, Naruto went up and grabbed Haku's hand and simply walked them over to his small dining table where he looked at the pot on the stove. Did you make enough for yourself? Naruto asked. I made enough for you, Naruto. Naruto raised his brow in mock curiosity. Aren't you going to have any? Haku shook her head. I won't, though you enjoy. I'll make something for myself later. Instead of trying to convince her through normal means, Naruto picked a more practical one. He looked over to the clock on the wall and said, how are you going to make something else in 10 minutes? I could just eat something during lunch. Haku, please just eat with me here. Take some of the ramen you made and eat it. Silent Eyes just stared at him, trying to find an answer. With a sigh and a nod of submission, Haku trudged over to the pot and took a bowl before she started eating with him. Thank you. Strangely enough, as it is after Zabuza essentially abandoned her, she transferred her master-servant fetish to Naruto, and ever since he had found her almost 2 years ago, she developed this troubling mentality where she is essentially a tool and nothing more. It didn't take much to assume that Zabuza had tried to make her an emotionless puppet, but after living with Naruto for so long she mellowed out. However, every once in a while Haku would revert to her old self, a relapse of sorts, comparable to how Haku treated him a few months after his finding her. Haku just looked at him in between one of her bites. Well, after we're done eating we should get dressed quickly and head off to the academy. Alright. Haku snapped her fingers at Naruto shortly. And don't you dare wear that orange jumpsuit of yours. Haku said, I know you love that color, but you won't be loving it long after people start making fun of you because of it. He just nodded. Ever since she moved in with him she'd found that he favored the color orange for some odd reason, and after she found he wanted to be a ninja upon her asking, she'd begun scolding him continuously in an overall attempt to rid her young friend of the kill me color. If he said he didn't want to be a ninja, well, she wouldn't have minded since there was nothing saying a civilian couldn't wear such clothing. On the other hand, for ninja, it just wasn't in the job description to get yourself caught. Her progress on getting him out of those clothes, however, was ultimately abysmal at best. Naruto just couldn't leave the apartment without some kind of orange hanging off of him. Haku bucked her head after her last bite of ramen in rapt excitement. She had an idea. Naruto. He turned from his trip to their bedroom and locked eyes with her in a questioning glance. Would you feel comfortable with not wearing the jumpsuit if you had something smaller to have orange on? Naruto shrugged. Yeah, why? In that case we can stop by a store real quick to pick up a necklace, or perhaps some bracers. Haku softly exclaimed. There was no hiding the excitement in her voice or the slight smile on her face. Naruto chuckled. Alright. Walking down the road they weaved through the crowd with a slyness to them that some may think them to be masters of evasion, judging by how many people the two kids would slip by without so much as a light tap of the foot as the only evidence they were there. Normally when Naruto would begin to join the crowd on any other day, they'd give special attention by giving him a wide berth accompanied with harsh glares or the guttural sound of swearing. That was not the case for them now. Since his birthday he received a blank mask almost exactly like Haku's and had taken to wearing it as often as he could. The mask was special, he guessed. The top had a Konoha symbol on top, and 2 apparent seals etched into either side of the mask. When asked, Haku said that she'd had it taken to some seal master far out and had intended to use it herself before his appearance. As for the Konoha symbol, she had painted that on herself because from her tales of when she traveled she'd said that her birthplace was named Kiri and she'd used to have the symbol on top of her mask, as well. Now though, her mask remained identical to the one Naruto wore. Essentially when asked why Haku had even worn one in the first place, she'd tell him that she'd need to wear a mask to hide her identity in order to avoid being caught by individuals looking for Zabuza, and by proxy her. Naruto, we're almost there. Snapping out of his own revelry, Naruto grasped his mask and pulled it up. How the heck do you breathe in this thing? You'll get used to it. But Naruto, did you hear what I just said? Yeah, we're almost there. Haku nodded. Arriving at the entrance of the huge building, they'd spotted several children walking in, leaving several more outside. Taking the moment, Haku brought herself to Naruto slowly before carefully adjusting the dark orange gloves in a ploy to settle its unkempt look, and maybe her nerves a little. Naruto smiled and looked down to her small pale hands. She'd always do this. Every time she'd get nervous over something, she'd start to dote on him in one form or another. This time though, Haku apparently wanted to play the mother hen sending her child off to school, even though she was going to. He chuckled and looked at her usual clothes. From what she told him in passing, Apparently she'd always worn the same uniform and in fact had several pairs for some of those, just in case, moments. Looking at his own, Naruto found that her hands had left his and had begun adjusting all the clothes on him in an attempt to make it look the way she thought it should. His black no-sleeve shirt was first, then the standard shinobi pants were second, and finally going all the way to just glance at his sandals quickly before she took the orange necklace she bought him in her hands and strung it around his neck. Thanks, Haku said, grabbing his hand. Naruto just nodded slightly as he was led inside into the office real quick to find out where his Gigi placed him. Alright class, my name is Yumino Iruka and for the next 4 years you will all be under my tutelage. Iruka said. In this class there will be lessons in overall theory, history, mathematics, language, taijutsu, weapons training, and finally ninjutsu. If you do this right then I promise that you'll all pass and go on to be great shinobi and kunoichi. This is gonna be a long 4 years then. Naruto looked to his right to Haku sitting directly next to him. He was glad that Gigi had put them in the same class. It wouldn't have been much fun otherwise. Another bonus definitely was having Iruka as a teacher. He'd known him since he was much younger and had started to look up to the scarred man in a light akin to that of a brother. Haku raised her hand and pointed at Naruto, surprising him before she gestured back to the front. Naruto huffed a little before looking forward again. He must have lost himself for a while. Looking around again he saw several children he already knew of in passing. Their names were Tenten, Neji, Rock Lee, Kiba, Hinata, and Shikamaru. Any others he hadn't met yet, but maybe soon. He'd seen one guy in particular have several girls around him squealing. That was one guy he didn't like. As far as reputations went he had the biggest, however he still didn't know his name. That day was generally a course introduction day. The next, from what Iruka said, was for introducing the students to one another. More teamwork in bonds, he said. If you focus more on letting someone get to know someone, then the relationship will be stronger. That's why we have one day dedicated to just introducing people and less on the lessons. It's an easier transition and makes the atmosphere much more comfortable to learn in later on. After that, the lessons had gone relatively fast, with lunchtime being even quicker since no one bothered to come sit near him or Haku. Though every few minutes he'd find a pair of lavender eyes boring into him from somewhere across the clearing where Haku and him sat. Creepy. Naruto thought that maybe some may want to try and sit with him, but it didn't seem to be so at this point, even with the shade. That in itself was disappointing to a degree. He sincerely thought people may get tired of the sun and may want to rest for a moment under the comfort of the dark. No conversation needed. Just someone to acknowledge them, momentarily. Later, when Naruto asked his best friend about why no one was sitting with them, she'd said, "Naruto, do you remember how people on the street treat you?" He nodded. Well, there's a chance that they've passed this on in one form or another to their children. Even though it's unlikely, it's bound to happen when their child mentions you to them. Naruto sighed. He understood. For some reason all his life he'd been scorned for something. He'd never known what it was, but it certainly didn't help his confidence, since every time he made a friend they'd be gone the next day. He'd only pray that Haku didn't get taken from him. Well, Naruto, Haku said, offering him a hand, I think it's time we go. He looked up from his position under the tree and nodded calmly. A little later, when Naruto started to open his door, he heard Haku say, "You know, I'm wondering whether we'll be put under the same team." "I hope so. Hey, just in case, do you want me to teach you how to use Senbons?" "Yeah," Naruto answered excitedly. After 3 days passed, Naruto and Haku both stood strong in training ground 7, Senbon in either of his shoulders. Standing opposite, Haku had one arm outstretched towards him with one Senbon left in hand. "You see what happens now," Haku said. "When using Senbons in a fight, you can effectively incapacitate them with a flick of the arm and a point to the right spot. This can either damage them severely, as all weapons do, or enable them unconscious without serious damage, which most weapons don't do." Haku gently took the Senbon from his shoulder, eliciting a pain-filled grunt. I'm sorry. It's fine. I asked for it, anyways. Naruto said, putting his free hand on her shoulder. Haku just nodded and removed the other, but quicker this time. She observed his wound swiftly. When she'd launched her senbons into his shoulders, her initial response was to take out her herbs and clean it until she took out her first senbon and saw what was happening. The punctured flesh, by her eyes, was knitting itself together, faintly glowing a red hue. She could even hear it sizzle if she tried. Next, she removed the second senbon to get a more in-depth version. After seeing the response again, she looked up into Naruto's eyes. Did he know that he could regenerate like that? His brows shot up in confusion. Perhaps not then. Naruto. His eyes locked with hers. You know you heal quickly, right? Yeah. One time I got a cut on my arm and it healed in under a minute, Naruto said, scratching his head. I asked Gigi about it, but all he said was that I was special, or something. He had one of his medics from Anbu come and examine me just in case, though. Haku's eyes widened. What did the Anbu say? She said that I healed really fast, but she didn't go into detail. He shrugged. I'm just glad I have it. Haku's eyes lit up and her thoughts spiraled. If what the Anbu said is true, then that means a whole paramount of options open for him. Hey Haku, can we start again? I want to try and see if I can throw one too. Broke from her thoughts, she nodded and smiled gently. Those kind of thoughts could wait. Alright, Naruto, what you need to know first is that the body has many points at which these senbon can be rendered dangerous or even lethal. Haku pointed out. Truth be told, this was the first time he'd ever been taught one-on-one before, and believe it or not, he enjoyed it. The way that a teacher would pay special attention to him, valuing every little thing he did as if it were the most important thing in the world. It was a feeling that he'd never thought he'd feel. He'd seen it with families, but not so much as it was with how Haku did it. He couldn't explain it. She brought her hand up to his neck. Here is one place where a person can be killed easily, obviously. But one thing to remember about the neck is that it's the access to the brain, the spine, and your oxygen supply. Given enough practice, you could put someone into a death-like state or kill them swiftly or slowly. Haku said, there are many options. Next, her hand lowered to his heart. Here is the most obvious place that someone could be killed at, along with the lungs, liver, or stomach. She said, pointing to each organ. Naruto nodded. Auri, I want you to understand that even though I am a kunoichi, I don't like to kill. Haku said, pointing to his neck. She moved her hand slightly. I like to incapacitate if I can. The boy her finger was pointed at gripped her wrist before pulling her into a hug. Naruto looked down at Haku's downcast look. You know something, Haku? Naruto said softly. The girl in his arms looked up briefly. I don't think anyone does. You're just better because you can admit it and not turn off your sense of morals. He brought his hand to stroke her hair when she kissed his forehead, a smile on her face. Remember what I said about what makes one strong? Haku said, clutching him tighter. Naruto nodded gently. Of course. You're strongest when you have someone precious to protect, otherwise there is no reason to fight at all. She nodded as her clenched eyes let out 2 small tears. That's right, and remember Naruto. You'll always be my precious person. And you will be mine, Haku. No more crying, Kay. Naruto said, wiping away her tears. When did you get so mature? Naruto smirked. You can't say that I couldn't have matured since your arrival. No, but I was quite surprised with how many pranks you used to pull. Haku chuckled. Haku backed away. Alright, what do you say? Time to go home for the day. Naruto nodded quickly before putting on his mask and grabbing her hand. The next day, Haku and him weaved through the streets like before, with barely anyone giving more than a second glance before turning back. All in all, Naruto preferred it this way. He felt more accepted rather than completely hated, even if false. It was definitely more preferable to the scouring looks of the villagers or the uncertain looks in the sympathetic, or even the more heated looks the children usually gave him. It was nice. Or it was nice until a purple-haired kunoichi appeared in front of him. Haku went to grab him, but by then it was already too late. Naruto crashed into the taller girl, knocking her over with him. For a moment Naruto sat dazed until he pushed himself up to see the girl's face. Even in a scowl Naruto thought her to be cute. And if he remembered correctly he must have seen her somewhere before. However, as luck was, he'd been sitting there studying her face for far too long for the kunoichi's tastes. The woman grabbed Naruto at the top of his shirt and dragged themselves to a standing position where she hung him, a scowl still pressed on her face. "You do realize who you just ran into, right?" The woman bit out. Still seemingly staring, Naruto shook his head and gestured to Haku behind him. "No, I don't. Sorry, but me and my best friend are trying to get to the academy." Haku nodded to her to confirm. The kunoichi seemed to accept it because she dropped Naruto back on his feet where he stumbled a little into Haku's waiting arms. "I hope you both know that you just ran into Midorishi Anko, snake mistress of Konoha," Anko said, rubbing her hands egotistically down her sides in a sweeping manner. Now that Naruto was released and could see Anko fully, he started to remember. He turned his head to Haku shortly after Anko's presentation and whispered, "I remember her now. She's the one who we found last year in that alleyway, Haku." She tipped her head. "Ya know, the one who we let stay with us for 6 months. I remember now," Haku said softly, touching her chin. "Do you think we should let her know?" Naruto asked. Haku nodded. By now Anko was getting frustrated by the two's whispering. It wasn't often that she'd meet two people who would completely ignore her after her usual introduction. "Anko," Haku said. The woman raised her head from her momentary frustration and gave the girl her full attention with a loud sigh. Both of the kids brought their hands up to reveal their faces, with warm welcoming smiles. Anko's eyes widened in recognition. "Naruto." "Haku," Anko whispered. The two nodded slowly before Anko came to wrap the two in her arms. A few months after Haku had been taken in by Naruto, they'd found Anko sitting back to a wall in an alleyway during a thunderstorm. If Naruto remembered correctly, she'd worn a brown trench coat, with fishnet body armor along with a very short brown skirt. Her hair was matted to her head and she'd looked like she'd been crying for quite some time, judging by her puffy red cheeks. However, what made the image almost unbearable was the sight of a few bottles of alcohol lying next to her. From what Anko had told, she'd been suffering from severe depression ever since Orochimaru had left when she was younger, and in order to cope Anko had taken to alcohol in her snake mistress mask. When the two had picked her up and let her stay the next day, she'd told them about how the village treats her like some piece of traitorous garbage, but only after Haku had restrained her. A 9-year-old taking down a 13-year-old. If it mattered in any way to Anko, she didn't let it show, but after that Anko had stuck around at Naruto's insistence, and from what they could tell now, Anko had prospered from it. The kunoichi looked down at the two hugging her. She never told them, but if they hadn't convinced her otherwise, she would have slit her throat the next day. So, in essence, Naruto and Haku had saved her life. Even after her telling them about how she was previously the student of Konoha's most famous traitor, they still stuck by her. Whether that was from childish innocence or not, they still did what some shrink couldn't. Anko petted their heads. They were the only ones she'd ever show that kind of gentleness to. "All right, guys," Anko said, breaking the hug shortly after a faint bell could be heard not too far away, causing Naruto to groan and even causing Haku to sag her shoulders. Shaking her head, Haku looked up at Anko and said, "Sorry Anko, we have to go now. We're late for the academy." Taking Naruto's hand in hers and putting on their masks again, they dashed off. Though just before they traversed through the entrance, Anko caught them by placing a hand on either of their shoulders. They turned to ask why she was stopping them, to receive a soft smile and gentle hands taking their own. Anko led them through the halls and into their class after asking where. When Anko opened the door, she put on her mask too and scowled furiously. Each student sat with wide eyes at her before Naruto and Haku followed in. Anko tightened her grip on them before looking at Iruka. "Don't punish these two for being late. I held them up," Anko said simply. Iruka nodded quickly. He never had a masochistic streak, and he wasn't going to start. She turned to the two kids behind her and smiled again as she hugged the two. Shortly after breaking up, Haku spoke up, "We'll see you later, Anko." She nodded. Naruto grabbed her hand and held it for a moment to what she supposed was to analyze it quickly. He nodded and gave her one more tight hug before waving and walking to his seat following Haku. She gave a fond look and left, but not after one last glare to the rest. When Anko exited the academy, she opened her palm and found a picture. It was of the time when they spent the day celebrating her birthday. A real heartfelt birthday filled with laughter and childish joy. And it was captured in time, just for her. Anko looked to the sky. "Thanks, Naruto." "Hey Haku," Naruto whispered. "Thanks for teaching me that one trick." Haku raised a brow in questioning. "Remember when you taught me how to hide a senbon and then bring it up in your hand for combat?" Haku remembered all right. It had taken him quite a time to be able to pull it off to a satisfactory level. Though she wondered why he'd bring it up now. Haku gasped into her hand after she figured it out. "Naruto, what did you give Anko?" She whispered back. Naruto smiled knowingly. "Just a picture." Years had passed since Naruto had given Anko that little surprise, and in that time Naruto had gained a few allies along with Haku. First was a girl named Tenten. She was the spunkiest of them all, and after an embarrassing incident Naruto had learned why the brown-hair girl had loved weapons so much. After the first year in the academy and her subsequent joining, she'd apparently been watching the two in the back with a close eye and had judged them appropriately after talking with them under the shade of Naruto and Haku's favorite tree in the clearing nearest the school. Eventually she started to join them every day under that one tree, and she even went so far as to sit next to them during class. After that she would walk home with them under the guise that she wanted to hang out for a bit, which turned out to be fairly true. Although in Naruto's opinion he'd say that her shock was priceless since he guessed she'd never quite imagined that two 9-year-olds could live together without anyone supervising them. A few months later and Tenten had moved in with them. Essentially they just stared at her wide-eyed, but after her explanation about her own orphanage they made room easily and swiftly. Though Haku made it clear that she was the only one who would ever be allowed the honor of sleeping with Naruto under ordinary circumstances. When asked about the Hokage, Naruto just waved his hand and said that his Gigi wouldn't really care too much. Though from the tales that he'd tell Naruto, the paperwork following her leaving the orphanage would be fairly substantial considering some of the minor things that would require larger amounts of paperwork. The second person to really befriend them was the lazy Nara, who would always end up sleeping during class. Naruto had debated with Tenten and Haku about it, and they'd come to just think that he was lazy, not stupid. After all, who really would stay awake if you already knew it all? It made sense to them. Or at least that was their guess. It could have been the opposite, in that he could have just been lazy and just plain stupid. That theory was quickly put to rest, however, after his joining them under the shade, and a light conversation with him. According to Shikamaru, he'd been tested to have an IQ ranging somewhere near 180. So yes, he was a genius. And before they could ask, Shikamaru told them of what his father said to him about Naruto and how he should try to make friends with him, as troublesome as it was. Haku had actually asked him once why he hadn't tried earlier. All Shikamaru said was that it was too troublesome and said not to ask why he had done so now. And like a floodgate, two more friends followed Shikamaru's example. They'd made themselves known as Choji Akamaiki and one Ino Yamanaka. Naruto had actually narrowed his eyes slightly at the sight of Ino, since she'd do nothing but fawn around that one black-haired pompous brat in class. An Uchiha named Sasuke, Tenten had said to Naruto's bemusement. He didn't care for names really. They just made something look bigger and more impressive, and from what he'd been informed, as far as clans go, it was adequately true. The name represented the clan. However, what wrought Naruto's wrath on the Uchiha boy was when he actually came up to Haku and asked for her to go on a date with him. A simple request, but nonetheless it distressed Naruto enough for him to visibly tense and his eyes to widen. It was short-lived, of course, when Haku shook her head slightly before visibly grasping Naruto's hand in a silent gesture to the Uchiha. He'd narrowed his eyes acutely until finally he trudged back to his seat. That was their third year, and from then on Naruto harbored within him a form of hatred for the Uchiha, at least for Sasuke. The rest of his clan were an unknown since he'd only ever seen a few other Uchihas before. Once with Haku, and once when the three orphans were walking home together. The difference between meetings was that before they looked proud, with their chests puffed out with large smiles on their faces. Now whenever Naruto saw one they always had a somewhat empty look in their eyes. Naruto understood why though. Having one's clan nearly eradicated in only one night by one considered so precious was a sure blow to their pride, and for some the beginning of mental degradation into depression. A process undeserving of them if he, Haku, and Tenten had anything to say about it. Shortly after Sasuke's rejection, Haku had leaned over to what he assumed was to whisper something to his ear when she kissed his cheek, making him and by proxy Tenten blush since she'd begun watching to see and hear what she'd say. And what left Sasuke more confused was the beguiled look Naruto gave Haku after. Naruto had narrowed his eyes at Ino, grimacing at her wincing stance, and asked why. 10 minutes later Naruto held Ino in his arms while she cried. She wasn't a bad person. Just someone who needed a true friend. Not a one-sided crush, and heated rivalry. Choji was easy to figure out. He'd seen him follow Shikamaru around plenty of times before, so it really wasn't an occasion of how he came to be there, it was a situation of when. And in Naruto's eyes Choji was fun to hang out with, but upon inspection Haku had said that she'd prefer it if he didn't eat all the time in front of them with such a loud bite. Of course, she had only said that to Naruto and Tenten when they'd reached their apartment again. Through it all, though, Naruto went through the academy scoring very well in the class as the #1 student for males with Haku as the #1 for females. Tenten had scored just below Haku with Shikamaru and the others scoring in the middle. Why Shikamaru decided to score so low was a question on how fast he fell asleep during their tests. The other courses on the other hand proved their prowess in battle, since every day after school Naruto would take whoever was willing to the abandoned training ground 7. Naruto had taken interest in Haku's senbons and could accurately acupuncture someone into a death-like state identical to Haku. Tenten had taken to using an arsenal of weapons and a fair hand at Fuinjutsu in order to be able to use her own unique battle style she'd developed. The others just grew into their family's jutsus and continuously practiced with them whenever they had time to spare. One thing that set them apart from the rest, besides becoming friends, were the white masks harboring the Konoha symbol on them. Once as a group they'd confronted Naruto and Haku with the issue, and as reward they'd just told them about the benefits of wearing one among hostile people. It was the truth, after all. However, what they didn't expect was for each of them to ask for one as well. Apparently if they had one the others wanted one as well. Monkey see monkey do, nay. Alright everyone, settle down. Iruka shouted, arms waving. Hey Naruto, Shikamaru asked from one seat ahead. What sensei do you think you're going to get? He shrugged, he honestly had no idea. Looking over, Haku said softly, do you think that Anko will become ours, Naruto? Naruto smiled and brought Haku into a firm hug where he kissed her forehead. Maybe. Haku smiled brilliantly with flushed cheeks. Naruto. The blonde sighed dramatically, granting smiles to the others around him. Yes Choji. Do you think any of us will be on a team together? Probably. Naruto exclaimed. Seeing the confused look on Choji's face, Naruto elaborated, Choji. Your parents are the famed Ino-Shika Cho trio. I know they're going to recreate that group simply because they were so famous. Oh. Naruto sat back and waved. No worries, if anything we'll still be able to train together regardless of our senseis. The others nodded and turned back around at the sound of the door opening. It seemed their Junin senseis were here. Several walked through the door, but only one really caught Naruto and Haku's attention. Anko had told them a while back about her taking Ibiki's place as head of interrogation. From her tales they'd gathered that Ibiki wanted to pass on his expertise through younger, more creative, minds. That had raised their curiosity quite some, and from then they'd proceeded onward to finding out why by asking the man himself. At first he simply said that he just wanted to try and train some genin, but upon further inspection he confirmed that he wanted to grow the interrogation department and, from what he'd been told, the best way to do that was by expanding the awareness deeper into the roots where everything began. So when Naruto's group saw him they weren't as surprised as others. The prime example being Iruka's wide eyes as he saw Ibiki's black trench coat flutter behind him. As if scanning the room for targets, Ibiki's eyes crossed Naruto's. His eyes widened for a split second before smirking and crossing the room to where Naruto was sitting. Ibiki stood tall looking down on Naruto, Haku, and Tenten as he pointed at the three and made the gesture to follow when he began to walk to the entrance. "These maggots are mine," Ibiki said. Opening the door, Ibiki looked back once more to see the three standing obediently behind him. "Meet me at Training Ground 44 tomorrow evening and we'll begin." Dismissed. Tenten sat at the bar stool with stilled apprehension. She couldn't believe it. She just couldn't believe that Ibiki would choose them. And what she couldn't believe even more was how Haku and Naruto were acting. They just met the previous head of the interrogation and torture department again and they were acting like it was nothing as they sat and continued eating their ramen with a serenity she very obviously wanted to join. Haku stopped eating for a moment and looked over at Tenten calmly. It was obvious she was troubled, but they'd all met him before and he seemed to be an overall companionable person. Putting aside his sadism, he wasn't that bad. She recognized that when she'd met him, and from the look on Naruto's face she'd say he understood as well. Deciding to put Tenten's fear to rest, Haku took one more bite from her ramen and began, "Tenten, you shouldn't be so troubled, you know." Haku smiled lightly. His position doesn't make him someone utterly cruel. It's his job, and besides we've met him previously, yes. Tenten nodded. "Well, in that case you should remember how he treated us. He may have had a rougher voice and more exaggerated statements than most, but his overall stature towards us was one of a comrade. So I doubt his test or even training would put us into any compromising positions." Tenten nodded dumbly as she started eating her ramen. Naruto just smiled at the two of them. Haku was always a good counselor, and since she was like family he'd try to mimic her every once in a while to ease her nerves sometimes. In fact, if memory served, the last time she really doted on him was when they were about to take the genin exam to see who passed and who didn't. They were just like family in his mind. He'd known Haku for 6 years and Tenten for just 3, but in his opinion she was just as important to him as Haku was. His stomach rumbled and he chuckled at both his best friend's looks. He looked to the woman named Ayame manning the counter and said, "May I have one more bowl of miso ramen, Ayame ne?" The young woman nodded quickly before yelling back to a man in the back named Tuki. From how long ago he'd known these two was a mystery to him. They'd been helping him since the beginning. And he'd dare say that he knew Ayame before Haku, which said a lot on his and their parts. However, he never did get to really know them as well as he wished. Even so, he thought of Ayame as an older sister of sorts and Tuki as a cool uncle. They'd be his protectors when the orphanage threw him out at age 4 by taking him in for 2 years without the Hokage knowing. Eventually though, the orphanage was pressed to let the Hokage know where he was since he'd been asking about him for some time. Anbu had swarmed Ayame and Tuki's house like locusts once they found where Naruto was, and after a very heated argument with them the Hokage had compromised that he'd set up an apartment for him. The rest was history. He found Haku, made friends with Tenten, and everything flowed after. Finished eating, Naruto paid the amount owed and actually went behind the counter to receive a hug from them before leaving hand in hand with Tenten and Haku. They were his family after all. "Take care, Naruto-kun," he heard Ayame and Tuki yell behind him. He just waved and said goodbye before heading off with a huge smile on his face. On the trip back, Naruto's mind worked. There was no really important reason. It had more to do with comfort than it did anything else. He nudged Haku and whispered something in her ear before she reared her head back in surprise. Taking a moment to think, she nodded and then turned her head behind Naruto's. Hey Tenten, Haku asked, would you like to join Naruto and I tonight when we sleep? Maybe that will settle your nerves. Tenten stumbled a step and fixed her pace. She looked to Naruto, who nodded and said, all right. All right, first we're going to introduce ourselves. State your dislikes, hobbies, and dreams for the future. Ibiki pointed to Naruto. You go first, Naruto. All right. I like Haku, Tenten, and all of my other precious people. I especially like ramen. Haku pinched the bridge of her nose and shook her head. I dislike people who don't try to understand things they don't know and remain blissfully blind. My hobbies are practicing my Senbon skills with Haku and gardening. He scratched the back of his head in thought before saying, my hopes for the future. I want to become a great shinobi one day and start a family. Ibiki nodded. He'd expected that. His being visited by the young blonde only aided his opinion and observation of the boy, never mind what he contained. Next he pointed to Haku, who stood and bowed shortly. All right Haku, you're next. Ibiki said shortly. The girl nodded. My likes are Naruto and all his precious people. I dislike killing. Ibiki raised his brow. My hobbies is also gardening and training with Naruto. Haku looked to the sky and clenched her fists. My dream is Naruto's dream. I want to become a great shinobi and I too eventually want to start a family. Haku said, peeking over towards Naruto's flustered stare. Ibiki snorted. Love birds. Lastly, Ibiki pointed to Tenten. You're up, panda. Tenten huffed her cheeks out for a moment and went to fly the bird at him until she felt Naruto grasp her hand softly. She went to glare at him but was stopped when she felt him peck her on the cheek. Remember Tenten, there is no reason to get mad. He's only teasing you. She looked to Haku, who smiled and nodded the same. She sighed and faced a bored-looking Ibiki. Fine, Scarface, my likes are my friends and my family. Tenten said. I dislike, however, pricks who think they're funny and bigots who don't know what they're talking about. My dreams for the future is to become the weapons mistress of Konoha and to also start a family. Wiping a hand over his face, Ibiki sighed. He wasn't overly impressed with their ambitions. Didn't any one of them wish to be something truly great other than being a simple shinobi? Why not Hokage? He groaned to himself when he thought about it. Naruto and Haku lived together, and from what he heard from Anko, she had always had a calm temperament about her, so it made sense in a way that Naruto would also come to have a more calm personality. On the other hand, with Tenten, she was a true mystery for him, and from their brief encounters in the past he'd say that Haku hadn't been in her life long enough to really truly calm her down the way she had Naruto. Her dreams were flared enough, so he could only assume. What had he gotten himself into? Alright maggots, now that that's out of the way we can begin. Ibiki said, reaching into a pouch in his belt. He pulled out 2 scrolls. One inscribed with the symbol for heaven and the other for earth. These scrolls are used in the Chunin exams, and if you look behind you, this is where a portion of where the exams take place at. My test for you all is simply survive in the forest and retrieve these 2 scrolls. He waved them in his hand mockingly. I'll place a seal on each of you to set off when any one of you start to slip into unconsciousness, at the request of Hokage-sama. The seal, that I will place at each of your upper right shoulder, will alert me to your position, as I will too come and monitor your progress. 5 minutes later, Ibiki threw the scrolls in the forest unceremoniously and waved them off, but with one last thing to say. You should all know that this team of genin here today will be named Team Ibiki or Team T and I. And with that they were gone. Naruto rolled and lunged out of the way of several leeches flying toward him as Tenten and Haku made their way over to hopefully assist him. Naruto slashed at a leech falling above him before one of the girl's hands managed to pull him out of the way of another. There just didn't seem to be an end to them. Haku threw several Senbon into the leeches. She didn't know about the physiology of leeches in general or that of most animals. She could only assume where the most vital points were and shoot. She'd only studied about the human anatomy since Haku had never imagined a scenario where she'd be fighting for her life against something as simple as leeches. Heck, she didn't know where its face was under all the muck it had all around itself. Tenten wasn't much better and continued to throw her arsenal of weapons at the offending creatures until she believed they were dead. Which in itself was a show, because if they'd get too close to one they'd assume dead, it would attempt to attach itself to whatever it could in what they guessed was its last resort. Though at the rate Tenten was losing her weapons, she probably wouldn't be of much use after they fought off the leeches and continued on. Out of all of them though, Naruto seemed to have the easiest time. His style of fighting was that of a brawler, and because of that fact his approach to battle, besides the Senbons, was him simply coming up with creative ways to take someone down without hurting himself too badly in the process. It was how he was capable of taking on Sasuke's own reactive type of taijutsu back in the academy whenever they would spar against each other. This meant for Naruto the use of the environment around him to its full potential, from breaking off a branch to kicking a rock in order to fend off the beasts around them. Finally having enough, Haku decided to use her Hyoten abilities to protect them as she summoned mirrors made of ice all around them into a dome, blocking the leeches out. Ibiki sat a distance away on the limb of a tree and watched the fight between his soon-to-be students and the leeches. To say he was fairly surprised would be an understatement. He'd never considered the possibility of Haku possessing a bloodline. Then again, there wasn't anything to go off of, and knowing how chatty Anko was, he was surprised that he hadn't heard anything about it, so maybe she didn't know. He knitted his eyebrows together. No, she probably was asked not to tell, and knowing Anko's connection to Naruto and Haku, he could see why. Ibiki snorted. If Haku wished to keep it a secret, it was fine with him. He'd keep his mouth shut. Ibiki's eyes widened when he realized what they were doing. Haku was using her ice release to ward the leeches off, while Naruto and Tenten were throwing weapons out to keep them away. But what really surprised Ibiki was the fact that Haku was walking and moving her ice barrier forward with her. If his observation was correct, he'd give them an A for teamwork. Once the team made it out from the attack, Naruto took a moment to take in the area and analyze it in depth while the girls rested themselves inside the hollow of a tree. Tree vines hung every which way as if trying to ensnare someone in all its disarray. The sun was blotted out by the vastness or the sheer enormity of the gargantuan trees. It almost seemed to be a competition for them in Naruto's mind. Who could grow the tallest, the fastest? He chuckled into his hand as small droplets slithered down his face in anticipation. What else they'd meet in the large forest would no doubt be worse. Naruto turned his head when he heard Haku's sigh and lean on Tenten for support. That bloodline of hers really sapped her energy, and by the looks of Tenten he'd assume correctly that she was feeling the same right about now. Naruto frowned. Should they stay there and risk being ambushed, or risk going out with minor fatigue? He hardened his face in thought before he made his way down to the other side of Haku. Naruto took a peek at Haku's face again. Her breathing was shorter, her skin was flustered red, and her eyes remained half-lidded as she seemed to stare off into space at her own thoughts. Leaning forward slightly, he looked around and eyed Tenten's disheveled form. Like Haku, her skin and breathing were rigid, but her own eyes seemed to peek in his direction. He leaned back and made his decision. Leaving now would ultimately be fatal for them. His mind was made and it would not be changed. Not while his teammates and best friends were in their current condition. Thinking quickly, Naruto grabbed some netting from his pack he'd made the day before and started stringing it up with his senbon at the beginning of the entrance. Hopefully it was a good camouflage. Tenten saw what he was doing and smiled. Good thing we came prepared. They'd spent the better part of yesterday evening and early morning preparing their packs before training in a last-ditch effort to make sure they were prepared. And right now, it seemed to be coming in handy too. Naruto went to sit down and made to shut his eyes when Tenten growled. He'd forgotten to put down the scent eraser. With confused eyes, Naruto watched his brown-haired friend clamber through her bag for something before coming out with a bottle with something clear in it. She tossed it to him and gestured to the door. Oh, yeah, he forgot to eliminate their scent. Naruto stood and whispered an apology to receive a wave before pouring some of the clear fluid onto the ground and around the entranceway to thoroughly kill the scent. At least if they were to stay there, they'd be safe. Off in the distance, Ibiki smirked. They weren't far now, and from the looks of it they'd be able to make it through without his assistance. Looking back at things, Ibiki didn't care whether they passed or not. He'd met them before and knew they'd make a great team. That didn't mean though that he didn't need or want to see what they were capable of, and from everything that he saw, he could have had them become Chunin with the way they were acting. Ibiki rubbed the bandana on his head. Maybe he was getting ahead of himself. The kids were good, he'd give them that. But they still had yet to fully tap into their full potential, as every genin finds when they begin. He tapped his chin. He'd just have to pull it out of them. Morning came for the trio much too quickly for Haku's tastes, as she showed her frustration by attempting to burrow her head deeper into her pillow. She lifted her head though at the deep rumbling groan below her. She smiled slowly with a blush and slowly opened her eyes to meet deep blue. Am I that comfortable? Naruto asked. Haku nodded and kissed his forehead. Very. Another groan alerted them, and the two looked down to Naruto's left side to see their brown-haired teammate drooling onto Naruto's shoulder. Tenten had apparently decided to join them, again. Naruto chuckled as Haku tried to pry Naruto's arm from her, but to no avail. A minute later, and a waiting pair, Tenten opened her hazel eyes in wonder when she felt two small pecks on either cheek. Rearing back, Tenten could have sworn that Naruto and Haku just kissed her. Haku put a hand over her mouth when Tenten fell over herself in only what she could assume was embarrassment, if her cheeks were anything to go by. Nearly breaking her usually calm face, she felt Naruto wrap his arms around her as he fell back down on his mat. Naruto gave her a cheeky smile and kissed her nose. Remember, you two, only within our family do we do this, alright? Haku smiled and nodded. Bringing her head close, she touched heads with Naruto. The blonde reached out and grabbed Tenten's arm in a silent question. She shook her head momentarily before joining them. Only within the family, Tenten said. They'd found the first scroll. 2 hours later, after they awoke, the seals on their necks burned slightly as they drew nearer. Only when Tenten pressed it to her neck on accident did the pain stop, which caused all three of them to grumble. Naruto had shook his head in mock embarrassment, saying he should have known he'd do that, knowing how sadistic he was. Haku and Tenten agreed shortly after as they continued on. Each had different thoughts on why Ibiki did it, but in the end kept it to themselves. No need in angering their sensei and worsening their training after they gathered both scrolls. Now they were just searching blindly for it, hoping to stumble upon it before dusk. Their initial plan of just following where Ibiki threw it was out since their finding the first scroll. They'd long since lost their sense of direction in between night and day and the sure distance they traveled. Though Haku did wonder why Chunins had such trouble with the grounds. Besides the more violent things in the forest, it was quite scenic when someone took the time to stop and take in everything. She'd followed Naruto's example that morning, at his insistence, and she had to agree, it was rather peaceful. She'd ask later. Running fast in the trees, they used their chakra to enhance their speed to hopefully find the scroll faster. Each step was a gamble as they leapt from tree to tree, hoping not to fall down below because of the moss slicking the surface. With Naruto in front, his job was to look every which way to try and anticipate for any signs of danger or that lovely stinging pain. Tenten ran in the back, where she spent most of her time switching views from left to right and focusing her hearing in case something came from behind. Over time they could faintly feel a distinctly light pain where the seal was, but more often than not, whenever they started to feel it get more intense, it would just suddenly disappear. And after an hour of chasing that pain, they came to the conclusion that someone was moving it. Not something. No animal could move that fast and disappear so frustratingly whenever they got closer. Surely it was something else. But what exactly would purposely move a scroll with the symbol of heaven on it? After a moment of thought, they all smacked the top of their masks. Ibiki. Tenten swore a storm as they moved, only to be calmed slightly at the warning look Naruto gave her. They needed to be silent if they were to catch him. But after more than 2 hours of non-stop running and sweating, the trio all stopped to catch their breaths inside some cave they'd found. I'm going to murder that prick. Tenten breathed out, her eyebrows knitted together. Naruto waved his hand. There's no need. I've figured out what we need to do. The two girls snapped their heads up. Hopefully it wasn't something that required a lot of running. They'd had enough of that for the day. Naruto waved his hand down, gesturing to the ground, and nodded when the girls both slowly kneeled down. For now, we can rest. Naruto explained. Tenten opened her mouth to reply until Naruto interjected quickly, knowing what she'd think. If it takes us another night, it takes us another night. Ibiki-sensei never set a time limit for us. Naruto said, however, that's not my plan. Haku and Tenten both nodded and sat down against the wall, waiting. Good. Now my plan is to simply go back to the entrance and wait for him there. Naruto explained, casually. Tenten removed her mask in a fit of annoyance. Finally everything was catching up with her as fatigue set in. Naruto, you know that's a stupid idea. Why quit now? You just said there was no time limit. Naruto nodded. Then why? Tenten threw her arms into the air, showing her exhaustion. It's because when we get there, all we have to do is wait for him. He chuckled at their baffled looks. The goal was to get the scrolls, and he knows we can't keep up with him. It doesn't make sense to outrun him, so why not play with his head? We could give him the impression that we're quitting and set traps for him as he comes back. Haku nodded. It may work. Though Tenten frowned with a hand under her chin. I don't think Ibiki-sensei is one to fall for things like that. He's a prick, but a smart one. Tenten pointed out. Naruto just smiled, pulling the two up as he walked out. Then we'll just have to be smarter, nay. 4 hours later, Ibiki stopped feeling their presence in the area. Usually the scroll would alert him of where they're coming from as soon as they stepped in range. But now they disappeared. He grimaced. It wouldn't be good if they simply gave up. He knew they had figured out his little trick and knew the feeling of the scroll's presence. So why give up? Ibiki wiped his hand over his face, scowling. He guessed they weren't anything special after all. He shook his with disappointment. He'd take them anyways, but that didn't mean he had to accept how they finished it. He smirked. Anko owed him a lot of money now. Making his way back, Ibiki looked around. The forest was grotesquely beautiful, in his opinion. The way the light could only make it in small rays, illuminating the very path he took as he jumped from branch to branch. The Chunins would have to step up their game if they were to make it when the next exams took root. The forest was often going in stages that would increase in lethality throughout the year before the village would be tasked with maintaining the dangerous conditions. And by maintaining he meant burning the forest floor to nothing but a pile of ash. Luckily, when the genin are chosen for their teams, the forest is relatively calm, with new life just being born into something more ferocious. His team should be thankful that the forest was just recovering, because otherwise, they wouldn't be able to rest a single second. Ibiki looked ahead and narrowed his eyes at the trio just before the entrance. They'd be trained to the ground before he would let them go. That was for certain. Spotting Ibiki, Naruto smiled behind his mask and waved at him, with the girls following his lead. He'd only need to keep Ibiki distracted long enough for him to be caught in their trap, and then they'd each stroll through his pockets before eventually finding the scroll. In the corner of his eye, Naruto caught Tenten and Haku both rubbing the spot on their necks. It truly was painful. Ibiki landed before them and took a few steps towards them. From the looks of it, he wasn't happy. You do know. His eyes shot open at a familiar sound coming from nearby. It sounded like something was unwee. Under some leaves around his feet, a lasso constricted around him as he quickly looked down. Those little. And that was all he could muster out before his legs were ripped out from underneath him. His body flew into the air as he felt something cold enter either of his arms and neck. When his body fell slack and blood rushed to his head, he started looking closely with his eyes as his other limbs were nulled. Ibiki's eyes hardened and Naruto smirked, all the while setting his arm back down. Tenten took the pleasure of searching Ibiki, and Haku stood with force and Bon at the ready. Never knew if Ibiki had something else up his sleeve. They all flinched though when Ibiki started laughing, making his face redden even further. Wow, is this what you've all planned? Ibiki gasped out. Guess I must be getting rusty if a bunch of genin caught me. Tenten removed the scroll and pressed it to her neck once the correct pouch was found inside in relief before she tossed their safe haven to Naruto and Haku, who just as quickly pressed it to themselves. Yeah, well, we got tired of chasing you and realized that we wouldn't have been able to anyways. Naruto answered. Finally. Haku continued after a moment. So Naruto's plan was to use this as an excuse for us to make it back to the entrance where we came up with this. Tenten nodded proudly, carrying a huge smile. They'd done it. They passed. Tenten's tired frame shook with excitement at the revelation. Haku smiled faintly behind her mask and leaned into Naruto's shoulder. Seeing this, Tenten mimicked Haku and leaned into his other side. What could they say? They were tired. Naruto blushed discreetly and attempted to put on his mask, whereas Haku merely shook her head, amused. Tenten just stared at Ibiki, a sadistic grin slowly marking her face. If you're all done prancing around, I'd like to get down. Ibiki scowled. Opening her mouth, Tenten was about to belittle him when she felt Naruto wrap his arm around her waist. That silenced her just before she could utter a single insult towards Ibiki. Not one to be left out, Haku took his arm and set it around hers. Lately things had been uneasy with them. She'd have to figure that out soon. Walking forward, Naruto cut Ibiki down as Haku and Tenten each removed a senbon. Sickeningly, Tenten seemed to chuckle a bit at their teacher's grunts of pain. Haku wasn't much better, as she was silently chuckling by biting her lower lip. She was never one to cause harm without just cause, but maybe just this once she could enjoy being a sadist to a sadist. Once Ibiki stood tall on his feet again with full mobility of his arms, he grinned. He hadn't expected it, and he'd paid the price. And when he'd silently made for the gate, he silently swore to himself about offices and something rusty. Noticing something, Haku stopped and softly called for Ibiki. When she got his attention, she walked up to him with Naruto and Tenten calmly. When do you want us to meet with you for training, Ibiki-sensei? Haku asked. Ibiki rubbed his head. He'd forgotten about that. I think for tomorrow we'll be training at ground number 7. He cracked his knuckles, and be ready because you will throw up. Haku went to ask something else, but before she could, Ibiki interjected. I know what you're going to ask. I'm not going to tell what we're doing. I want to keep it a surprise. The trio frowned together and the two girls tightened their grips on Naruto. If there was one thing they hated most, it was being unprepared. And if they followed what Ibiki said, they would be forced to go there with only the most generic ideas of what would happen. That wasn't good. Bring all of your equipment and scrolls. Ibiki said, surprising the three. Naruto collapsed. The training was hell. Haku and Tenten sat beside him, throwing one arm around their shoulders to help keep him up. You know, I honestly thought Ibiki-sensei would try and take it slow with us for our first day. Tenten chimed. I agree, but compared to other genin, I think sensei sees us in a superior light. Naruto tilted his head. Remember when Kakashi-sensei's team came here? Naruto nodded. Of course he remembered. Kakashi and his team of Sasuke, Sakura, and this one kid named Itsuki had come to train at the same training ground and had calmly demanded, that their sensei go find another place to train. Ibiki had just smirked and pointed to Naruto. You'll have to beat my genin first. Apparently Ibiki was one of those guys that loved making bets. The difference between himself and others was that he was never one to make a bet unless he thought he was going to win. It just wasn't how he played. Kakashi looked over to the other team and seemed to study them. From what he'd heard about Kakashi, and that wasn't much, Naruto could safely assume that Kakashi was a skilled but closet pervert of a shinobi. His eye could never quite make it to Anko's face whenever they saw one another, which was why the purple-haired Kunichi had taken the effort to keep Naruto grounded and respectful beyond what Haku had already passively instilled. It still confused him to no end when he thought about it. Looking someone in the eye wasn't difficult, so why did men's eyes always flicker down to a woman's chest? He sighed. He'd just ask Anko later on. She'd always gave him advice on things like this. You're on Ibiki-san. How do you want to play this? Kakashi questioned, a bored look. I'm fine with anything, cuz no matter what your genin do, they'll never win. Kakashi nodded. Fine. How about we have Sasuke and Naruto face off and the other two have a double duel of sorts? Ibiki smirked devilishly and agreed with a nod. Keeping his stoic mask pressed, Kakashi's thoughts flurried through. He'd read the genin's files when they were choosing teams a while back. His assumptions back then had been changed slightly, accompanied by new thoughts. Naruto was his sensei's student and he bartered for the Uchiha instead because of the council's demands, and when he requested for Naruto to be on it as well, the Hokage had said that Naruto and his friend Haku were a package deal because of certain circumstances. Though when he said that he would take them both, the Hokage had interrupted by saying that Ibiki had already chosen them and another just before Kakashi had walked in. He'd nearly thrown a fit internally before deciding to leave with the genin he thought would work well with Sasuke. One of them a fangirl and another a silent kid from a civilian family. Why take a fangirl and civilian born, some would ask. Well, as far as Kakashi saw in her file, she was the third best kunoichi in her class with a sharp mind. He'd work with her about the fangirl issue later. And as far as academics went for guys, Itsuki was one of the best with a contingency for genjutsu and weapons. The only thing Kakashi could think about working with him on was his silence. While a good thing in most cases, there had to be balance and communication in order for a team to work. Insert communication for him and they'd be perfect, for the most part. Thinking back to their test and how horribly they did. He would have failed them because of the lack of camaraderie between them, but thanks to the council he couldn't afford to fail them, otherwise the council would be all over him one way or another. Either through missions or daily life, the council would slowly intrude upon it as a silent fit of revenge. Now his plan was to hopefully show his team what real teamwork looked like, all the while showing Sasuke humility since he seemed to lack it altogether. He stretched his eye to see Sasuke. He remembered their conversation after the exam about Naruto and how Sasuke supposedly held back against him in the academy, and how the girl he liked rejected him, favoring the Dobi. Kakashi wasn't fooled. Sasuke had always went all out against Naruto when they sparred, and each and every time Kakashi knew that Ibiki's student had been holding back because he simply didn't think harming Sasuke was worth the backlashing mouths of his fangirls. Or it could be something that Hokage-sama mentioned a while back. Something about Haku's fetishes. Kakashi frankly didn't know. He could always ask Ibiki later when he went to check in on the T&I department. Sasuke, you will have to go all out if you want to beat him. Kakashi said seriously. Sasuke let out a guttural growl, clenching his fists. Not against the Dobi, I don't. Plastering a serious tone, Kakashi rebutted. Sasuke, if you don't take this seriously, Naruto will beat you. He's been able to in the past, and, from what Ibiki mentioned to me the day before, he's capable of doing it again. Sasuke just shook his head and glared at his sensei. Chuckling, Ibiki interjected, if you two are done, I'd like to get this show on the road. The silver-haired Junin nodded and gestured for his team to get ready. Only feet away from Ibiki did Naruto and his family stretch, preparing themselves. Putting needles in the seams of their clothes and sealing scrolls, they hid them in different compartments of their clothing. Taking extra care to tighten some strips of clothing with bandages just in case. And finally each of them adjusted their white masks, with Naruto silently putting chakra into the seals located promptly on either cheek of his mask. When they were finished and looked ready, Ibiki called over to Kakashi's team. They looked deadly in Itsuki's head. Eyeing each other, Naruto took note of Itsuki's naginata being firmly gripped with a stone resolution etched onto his tan skin. His brown hair laid slicked back in a deadly form, aiding his hardened hazel eyes. Oddly, he looked ready to kill whenever his will was pushed. The clothes he wore spoke volumes to Naruto. The kid wore nothing but black. Everything had black on it, even the bandages were colored black, for crying out loud. Next, Naruto's eyes fell on Sakura. Her frail form was shivering in odd contemplation as her eyes flickered to her teammates and back to them. In fact, if Naruto looked hard enough, he'd bet he could see Sakura's cheeks blush slightly as her jade eyes seemed to molest Sasuke. Lazlati, he glared at Sasuke through slitted eyes and mentally growled. Ever since that day he'd hated the Uchiha. Irrational maybe, but his heart told otherwise. He didn't know why, but every time he saw Sasuke, all he saw was a target going after the person he considered most precious. He'd throw a kunai if it meant that it would make him stop. Hajime. Ibiki's team disappeared suddenly and reappeared behind them. Haku threw a silent kick at Itsuki's mid-back, throwing him forward and into a tree where he fell back unconscious. Tenten grabbed Sakura from behind before putting her into a choke hold, effectively putting her to sleep. And lastly, Naruto went to disable Sasuke through his Senbons, but was surprised when Sasuke actually managed to turn and roll out of the way in time. Not wasting any time, Naruto was on him in a matter of seconds and barraging him with multitudes of kicks and punches to meet either air or tender skin. Minutes passed and Haku was becoming anxious. She looked over to their sensei and decided to ask whether they could join or not. But before she could, she heard a loud yell and turned to see. Pinned under a knee and a Senbon in each limb was Sasuke. He'd gotten after a few blows that managed to miss him and let his guard down to hopefully perform one of his jutsu before Naruto had used that time to throw four Senbon that had emerged from the seam of his wrist. Whereas the blonde just put his knee on top of him in mocking victory. Haku and Tenten smiled jovially under their masks. They both knew Naruto had wanted to do that for a long time, because whenever Sasuke was in a manner of 10 feet he'd glare at him. Which Naruto didn't do very often. He was either a very caring person or an uncaring one, but to show true anger from him meant that someone did something really bad. And from what Naruto had told them, he had a good reason to be. The Uchiha had essentially tried to get in between their family and him. Now Naruto could release some of the anger that had festered for the Uchiha. It really was a good day. Well, looks like my genin won, Kakashi. Ibiki boasted. Now get out. Intel. Alright, back to training. Ibiki said, a menacing smile encroaching on his face. Ya know something? Tenten said. What? It feels good to be put on a pedestal. All three nodded and smiled. It did. Peacefully they got up and started to leave before Haku remembered something. She hitched her back and found their sensei walking towards them. He seemed satisfied, of all things. Sensei, Haku called out, when do you want us to be here tomorrow? Broke from his thoughts. Ibiki shrugged. We'll skip tomorrow. You all did well today. Ibiki said, but know that if you don't try hard under my teachings, we won't have these breaks until you do start trying. Ibiki warned, hiding a smile. If anything, he knew they would work hard. He just liked messing with them. The three nodded quickly and picked up their pace. They wanted to enjoy what was left of the day. Naruto walked side by side with Tenten and Naruto as they made their way through the shopping district. As always, no one paid attention to them with the exception of a few shinobi who knew of the person under the masks. But why didn't they tell anyone about it? They were ordered not to. Ever since some of Hiruzen's genin started wearing masks, he'd noticed more people becoming anxious around them. From what he could only guess and assume, it was just a bunch of rumors floating around. However, one rumor he'd heard from some of his Anbu had him bristling in his seat. One of his shinobi was trying to let the civilian populace know about the people under the masks. The whole purpose, for Naruto, was the sanctuary that mask provided and the friendship that wrought between him and his friends. If they found out about who was underneath, Hiruzen didn't want to think about it, the hateful looks Naruto would get again. He could only thank Haku for it, since Naruto had told him shortly afterwards who came up with the idea, and what would have happened if he hadn't accepted. That's when Hiruzen ordered that if any one of his shinobi was to mention the identities of anyone who wore those masks, then any active shinobi around him or her were ordered to execute upon notice. It was clever, really. The trio smiled as they entered a shop. It was said to be a completely new place with a bountiful supply of weapons. Supposedly they were stronger and could be wielded much easier than other kunai or shuriken, but they didn't care. It was really just something for them to do together rather than a shopping spree. The store did look new with furnished floors and well-painted walls. Stacks of different weapons hung from unique stands at several points in the room, with shelves and shelves packed with finely made weapons from the katana all the way down to a few fuma shuriken. Instantly they made their way to a shelf full of smaller weapons. Each looked up and down the shelves until Haku gasped and grabbed a single senbon from one of the shelves before she closely started to examine it. "This is chakra metal," Haku whispered. Leaving the store, Haku sighed happily with a case full of new senbon and Tenten a case of new kunai. His wallet sure took a hit today, Naruto grumbled mockingly to himself. When they reached their apartment, Haku and Tenten went inside and set down their things before running back to and hugging Naruto, making him blush. "Thank you, Naruto," Haku and Tenten calmly said. "All right, Kakashi, what do you want?" Ibiki asked, annoyed. Ibiki had just finished with his team's training an hour before and he'd intended to check in on Anko to make sure she was doing her job. That was until Kakashi started to follow him. At first Ibiki ignored him in the hope that he would leave peacefully. He wasn't in the mood to be screwed with, and Kakashi was doing a number on him just with his presence. Ibiki turned left and right in the hopes that Kakashi would finally get bored and go, but to no avail. Finally he'd had enough. Appearing behind him, Kakashi materialized and strolled to the side of him. The scarred man threw Kakashi a long glare, silently asking his question again. Instead of answering, Kakashi looked forward and whispered, "Not out here." Furrowing his brows, Ibiki nodded. A hand sign, Ibiki shunshined into his old office with Kakashi grasping his shoulder firmly. Anko's eyes slitted when she saw Ibiki standing in front her desk and was about to ask why when she saw Kakashi step out from behind him. She just raised her eyebrow in annoyance. "Need I ask?" "No, but I need you out." "Why?" "Because Kakashi was about to ask me some questions," Ibiki said bluntly. The kunoichi turned her glare to Kakashi where he withered helplessly. He never did like angering her. She was the only kunoichi who could effectively put him down for some reason. "It's about Naruto." "Then I'm staying." "Anything about him, I can answer," Anko stated simply. Raising an eyebrow, Kakashi gave her a bored look. "Then can you also explain some things about his friend Haku as well?" "Yup." Kakashi I smiled and nodded before turning back to Ibiki. "I'm assuming that you will want to hear some of my questions too." He nodded. "Alright. My first question that I want answered was about Haku." Kakashi stated. "I remember Hokage-sama saying something about her once, but I can't remember what exactly." Anko grabbed the picture on her desk and held it close, looking at it. "First thing you should know, Kakashi-san, is that Haku-chan is the most moral person you will ever meet in your lifetime. The only reason she would turn on someone would be if someone decided to do something to Naruto and vice versa. I've heard that from Hokage-sama, but it's not what I was thinking." Anko nodded. There was so much she could praise about them, but what exactly did he want to hear? "You'll have to be more specific because I'm not going to spill their lives to you." The silver-haired Junin scratched his head side. Pulling a seat from near the wall, he sat down in a contemplative pursuit. What was it that the Hokage had mentioned about her during the assignings? Something about her innocence. No, that wasn't it. Well, Kakashi snapped his head up. Haku has always said how she hates to harm something. So I know she doesn't like to kill. Anko said quietly, almost dazed in Ibiki's opinion. Kakashi tilted his head and leaned on his hands. Without needing to ask, Anko answered, "I think the only reason she even became a ninja was because it was what Naruto wanted. She's always looked out for him, ever since those two were little." Anko said, smiling. "Ever since Naruto took her in, she's become his best friend, and as disturbing as it is, her reason for living." "But wouldn't that be bad?" Kakashi asked. Shaking her head, Anko clarified, "It isn't devotion. At first it was, but now." Anko sat quiet for a moment. "It's more love than anything." It's the way a husband would look at a wife. She snorted, but I'm not one to talk. Over in the corner, Ibiki listened to all this with closed eyes. The way those two looked at each other made sense. Their jaded pasts prevented them from actively or effectively reaching out to anyone beyond themselves, and since they'd lived together for so long, their perceptions were different. Why not as a brother or sister? Ibiki didn't know. Ibiki's eyes opened slowly. Now that he thought about it, if parents never taught their children right from wrong, then he was sure that incest would be a common ordeal in ordinary life. After all, if one wasn't taught something, how else were they supposed to know? Kakashi looked skeptically at Anko. Then do you know how Haku came to live with Naruto then? Surprised, Anko silently thumbed the picture frame gently and set it back down. She gave both of them a glare and merely pointed to the door. That's something that I can't say. Now get out. Nodding, Kakashi left, but not without taking the scowling Ibiki with him. He didn't like being forced out of a office that was previously his, so Kakashi generally pulled him out, escaping death by snake. Kakashi would have asked why, but seeing how Anko reacted, the subject must have been a sore one for her, but for her to be aggressive towards it meant that it was also sensitive to Naruto and Haku by extension. Well, Kakashi looked back at Ibiki and saw the sizable glare Ibiki sent. Well, what? Are you going to approach my students about this, or are you going to leave it alone? Kakashi rolled his head in thought. Should he? Nah. No, I don't think I should. He boredly glanced at him. Would you let me if I wanted to later? Ibiki shrugged. He didn't care. As long as they were ready for training, and soon missions, he didn't care. It's not like he knew them for that long. Nodding once, Kakashi shunshined back to his apartment, leaving Ibiki standing in the bland white hallway. He stood dimly lit in the moonlight and smiled. Things would get more interesting soon if things kept up. Riding high, the sun bore down on Naruto and Tenten as they made their way through the streets. Their destination, a drug store. Just the night before, when the trio were about to fall asleep, Haku had started coughing harshly into her elbow. And from the way Naruto looked, he'd stayed up all night comforting her when she could do nothing but lose her strength, coughing in his arms. Tenten walked closer to him and took his arm around her, causing him to peer over. You're tired. Let me help support you, Kay. Naruto nodded and leaned a little on her. He really was tired. Arriving at the drug store, Naruto pushed open the door with his free arm and walked inside looking for the owner. After a few minutes of just looking around, they heard someone call, "I'm sorry, I'll be right there." Opening a door in the back was Kakashi's student, Itsuki. He looked fairly surprised when he saw Naruto, but did a good job concealing it. "Hello, how may I help you?" he asked pleasantly. Naruto and Tenten smiled a bit somberly and told of the condition Haku was in before they were railed into finding the medicine. Itsuki asked about the symptoms, when it happened, and even what they did the day before, which should have been obvious, but then Naruto realized that he was most likely following protocol with the questions. Nodding a bit after hearing the symptoms, Itsuki motioned for them to follow him. Walking swiftly over to a shelf, Itsuki nimbly fingered his hands through the shelf and finally, with a proud sigh, he showed them the medicine they needed. Haku will most likely need to take a few days rest from all the strenuous activities. He raised his hand, silencing Naruto. And don't worry, she's just got a small cold. Seeing the relief on Naruto's face was worth it. If he hadn't chosen to protect his family through becoming a shinobi, he would have easily become a doctor and protected them from disease. And as a testament, he always operated the store when his parents were doing something. Whether that's something being a short time away trip to test new drugs or a simple walk to the grocery store and back. Either way, he loved working there. But he loved being able to protect more. That's why he envied the blonde for the love he gave and received from his team. Just by seeing them in action once could he deduce that they were a strongly knit unit. And the blonde's actions only went to strengthen his beliefs. His, on the other hand, were, for a lack of better words, unstable. The Uchiha was constantly brooding over something while his fangirl was always fawning over him. They had next to no team dynamic, which made his education worthless at the end of the day. If things kept up that way, he would go personally to the Hokage and request to be placed back into the academy to await for team assignments again, unless things started to seriously improve. He sighed. Better keep his daydreaming under wraps until he could go back to his room. Thanking Itsuki, Naruto walked out, medicine in hand, with a peaceful-looking Tenten supporting him still. Quickly they traveled back to their apartment with Naruto's step sagging every once in a while as a byproduct of his growing exhaustion. When they reached the apartment, Tenten walked him in and set him down on his couch. It seemed to engulf him as he muttered a thank you. Tenten championed a soft smile before kissing his cheek and walking into their room. On the bed laid a pale girl with black hair and a wet rag on her head. The sheets were pulled close as she opened her eyes sullenly. She was miserable, though her sickening look softened a little when she opened her eyes to see Tenten standing there with a bag. Haku was about to say hello to her but was silenced when Tenten shook her head and motioned for her to stay silent. Stay quiet, keep your strength. Haku smiled, went to push the sheets off of her. Her hand was grabbed and she looked to see Tenten placing 2 pills in her hand and a glass in the other. The drug store owner said that you just need some rest and these pills. You won't be able to train with us for a few days to get your strength back up, but you'll be feeling much better tomorrow, so you could probably come and watch in the shade while we train. Tenten said. The only reason she even mentioned Haku's coming was because of her iron, no steel will when it came to staying with Naruto. She remembered the last time Naruto was sick and Tenten had urged her to go to school the next day. Haku had looked miserable, constantly glancing out the window, biting her lip, and finally gripping her hands white. It was torture for Haku, Tenten was sure. And at some point Tenten had guessed that it all got to be too much because she basically walked calmly up to the class door, opened it, and dashed out. Later that day Tenten came home to be greeted with Haku snuggling Naruto's sleeping form as she played mother hen, as Naruto called it. Tenten would have laughed had it not been so sad. Haku smiled, a little wider, and gently swallowed the pills. The shade felt so welcoming under the humid sun. The feeling of relief under stress warmed her into a comforting sense, a soft smile edging its way on her face. She gently closed her eyes and as calmly as she could she smelled the air. It was such a refreshing scent of blossomed flowers that she nearly fell asleep from the comforting aroma. Haku-san. Her eyes opened slowly and her mouth turned into a small smile. Yes, Ibiki-sensei, I have something for you. Ibiki fingered his pockets for the item before he found and handed it to Haku. The front said, Torture and Interrogation 101. Frowning slightly, Haku opened the scroll and skimmed through. Marked in it were several manipulation techniques, some were physical and some were psychological. Looking away, Haku frowned and set the scroll on the ground beside her. Ibiki remained impassive. There was no doubt about what was going on in her mind. She wanted nothing to do with it. However, if she wanted to make it in their world and be able to stand by Naruto, she would have to eventually hurt someone. Might as well have some practice in it, where her job was to keep them alive while helping their cause. Study those while I keep an eye on Naruto-san and Tenten-san's training. Ibiki stated. As he walked back, he looked over his shoulder to find Haku staring at the scroll with silent disdain before solemnly opening it. She tried to hide a wince, but failed. If Naruto knew of what their sensei was doing, he would have made a scene without a second thought, with Tenten following right behind. He had no doubt that if put in a compromising position they would make sure to do everything in their power to stay together. Disturbingly though, he could almost feel that if pushed too far they could and would easily leave Konoha. He shook his head. Thoughts like that were a result of being in T&I and the constant feeling of paranoia. Ibiki talked himself down briefly before approaching his blonde and brown-haired students. Have you been doing what I asked? Ibiki said, a knowing smirk on his face. Naruto nodded. When Ibiki had left to give Haku a scroll, he instructed his other 2 students to practice a new jutsu the Hokage had cleared with them. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. From the looks of it, Naruto could create an outstanding amount before tiring. On the other hand, with his other student, Tenten, She just shook her head and pointed to a single clone sitting tiredly next to a tree. She just didn't have enough chakra. Enough practice though, and she'd be able to increase her chakra capacity to much greater heights at a much quicker pace, hopefully without suffering from chakra exhaustion. Alright, break time then. The two smiled tiredly as Naruto gently picked up Tenten, cradling her in his arms. She blushed slightly and leaned her head against his chest as he brought them over to sit next to Haku, who had since put the scroll a good distance away from her. Haku's face looked pale as her fingers shyly traced the edges of her haori. She loved the fabric Naruto bought her. It was a deep blue with tints of black stitched in, and each time she felt the absolute smooth fabric caress her, she felt like Naruto was holding her. Her cheeks tinted red. The feeling in her chest fluttering inside was triggered only by the approach of her best friend's form. She grabbed the fabric above her heart and buckled over. Widening her eyes, her blush slowly traveled across her face as she swore her heart skipped a beat. Just a few feet before, Naruto stood snuggling Tenten with the slightest tint of red adorning his sun-kissed face. He could, disturbingly enough, feel Tenten's body brushing against his. The feeling scared him slightly, but he pushed forward and offered her a small smile before he looked at Haku's seemingly troubled look. His eyes widened as he gently put Tenten down next to his troubled friend. He went to the other side of her and brought the brunette into a hug where she constricted before wrapping him in her arms. Haku tried settling herself and set her senses on calming thoughts like one would settle their mind for clarity. She breathed in his scent and held him tight. His overwhelming smell made him the ultimate sedative for her. But also the most potent stimulant. Boiling inside her, blood boiled without thought or recognition. I need to speak with Anko about this. Ignoring the urges within, she simply held on. I'm alright, Haku muttered. Naruto stared down at her, nodding. What did Ibiki-sensei show you, Haku-chan? Letting go, Haku sat back against the tree next to Tenten. With reluctant hands, Haku grasped the scroll next to her and showed it to them. At first, their reactions were simply shock followed by momentary thought and then absent anger. The silent glare he sent to the ground as he thought made it clear to Haku of what he was thinking. Reaching out, she grabbed Naruto's hand before feeling him squeeze back. Looking to her right, she found Tenten resting her head on her shoulder comfortably as if a pillow. Brown eyes opened and warmed underneath Haku's comforting gaze. For them, times like these were the most precious. Sitting under shade while the sun graced everything around them, Haku couldn't fathom a time where she was most happy before Naruto and Tenten. The closest she could come to was before, with her mother teaching her how to do simple things around the house. But that was as close to happiness as she could have gotten back then. Now she knew what true happiness felt like. Closing her eyes, she pulled Naruto and Tenten closer. If Zabuza hadn't left her, she would have never found Naruto, and then their lives would have been much different. Naruto would have started to dismember himself through his mask, and she most likely would have continued blindly following Zabuza. She chuckled. It must have been fate. An hour passed under the shade with a trio of sleeping genin under it. Ibiki walked slowly over to his team and stared. This would be perfect if I had a camera. The wind blew and leaves fell around him. He had an idea. Sitting down, Ibiki pulled out a large scroll meant for sealing and a bottle of ink. He'd just paint the scene. Bad or not, he'd have something to give Anko when he needed her off his back. The woman was just as sadistic as him when it came to interrogation, but if someone decided to disobey one of her instructions, they would find themselves in a very troubling situation. Hopefully his fair drawing skills would earn him some leeway with her sadism. Her family was her only soft spot after all. Brush met paper under scrutinizing eyes that flickered between his students and the drawing closely resembling them. A smile etched its way onto his face while he worked. The kids were slowly growing on him. They just had this warmth about them, separating them from others their age and unconsciously wising them further beyond their years. His first impressions from past experience and constant ramblings from Anko only cared to parent his thoughts. Sweat gathered on his brow and down his scar. A smirk appeared on his face after the final stroke swept over. Ibiki looked back up to the trio and back down. It was a fine piece, even if he did say so himself. The sky by then had since covered in dark clouds staring down on Konoha. His mind must have wandered far for him to have so much time to slip past without some warning. The last time something like that happened, he'd spent the whole day in T&I with a target without restraints placed on him. Meaning that if the prisoner died, no harm done. That led Ibiki to using some of what he called his toys and personal stock of homemade serum he kept hidden in his apartment, lest someone find them and store them away in their shed of regular supplies where he was sure he would never be able to use it. Chuckling to himself, Ibiki scrutinized his work more closely than before. In the picture, Ibiki had drawn a tree in rough black strokes with shaded leaves flying free and into the wind. The background was left blank for the manila color to save. Around the tree were more and more, but each less defined than the last. Under the first tree were his genin resting peacefully, both leaning on Haku. Naruto's head rested gently on her shoulder with Haku's head pillowing his. Tenten caressed Haku's collar with the warmth of her breath as her eyes remained shut. But what made the picture more valuable than before was what he had done with the colors. Everything was colored manila or black. But the three sleeping under the tree. They were each colored masterfully, deeply saturated in light colors. Though out of everything in that picture that would make Anko smile and truly make her go easier was their smiles. The looks on their faces captured the moment and showed their tranquility as they slept. Complete innocence in a time of unknowing and unseeing would show the true face and mind of one so near. Deciding to let the ink dry, he walked over to the three. With the way things are going, you three may be able to enter the Chunin exams. Ibiki's visage peered to the clouds overhead. If that came to pass, the question would then instead be on whether he would be able to proctor with his genin there. A cold chill writhed through his body as he looked to where it came from before another, and another, came down. His neck craned and he aimed his eyes to receive what looked to be water droplets raining down. Chilling, he ran over and picked up his painting and put it away. Wouldn't be good if his work was tarnished, and only after just being completed at that. Next he ran over to Naruto, Tenten, and Haku before he muttered an apology and shunshined them away, his hand outstretched gripping Naruto's forearm. The next moment they appeared in Anko's office, where she threw Ibiki a dirty look before softening her eyes at the sight of them. I figure you brought them here because of the thunderstorm and you didn't want to disturb them. Anko stated, looking fondly at them. Ibiki nodded. Well, I can't say I blame you. She cupped her chin. I remember when we ended up like that. Anko almost sighed in an amused nostalgia. We spent the night together, holding each other like we were the other's lifeline. Anko answered, knowing exactly his response. Setting them against the door with a light thud, Ibiki scurried through his pack while in the corner of his eye he saw Anko scowl slightly. He'd need to be more careful with them around her. Here, Ibiki said, holding out the scroll. Cautiously reaching out, Anko snatched the thing away from him and pried it open. Quickly she looked it over a second and sighed, Ibiki-san, I know you're a good drawer and all, but why give me this? Look closer. Anko nodded. She looked at the well-drawn leaves drifting lazily in the air. The very grass singing to the wind. Even the sturdy trees. Her eyes widened as her hand flew to her mouth. I see you finally found it. Ibiki chuckled. You know that, according to psychology, the thing with color standing with something blank will be noticed first. But apparently that's not the case with you. The scarred man nearly went into hysterics after Anko flipped him off in her sly pocketing of the painting. Recomposing herself, Anko sighed and crossed her arms over her trench coat and Junin vest. Ibiki looked over to Naruto and gestured back to Anko. Fine. Taking Naruto's forearm in hers, she made the hand sign for Shunshin, and the next Ibiki was left standing in Anko's office. That painting definitely earned him points. However, maybe he shouldn't have antagonized her for not noticing the kids right away. Then again, it was a picture of Naruto and her friends. She'd let him get away with something later on, he was sure. Drowsy eyes dazed at the sight of the sun's welcome. Looking tiredly around, he noticed a white room no larger than his own. The furniture wasn't familiar, the feel wasn't right. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he noticed the weight on him. Lying on his chest was one Haku who had taken the liberty of using him as her pillow, again. On the side was Tenten who, once more, had his arm in a tight cuddle. Lastly, looking to his right, his eyes shot open and his conscience pooled in thought. Sleeping to the side of him, Anko rested with her head mashed into the crook of his neck. How did I get here?